So, one of the great principles in Renaissance art is counterpose. In Italian, it's called contrapposto, but in English, counterpose, and sometimes also called torque. And very simple, you essentially twist the shoulders and the hips relative to one another, and that creates this wonderful dynamic stretch on the figure. So, this is one of Michelangelo's studies for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's a great example of it. So, let's see how this applies to animation. And this is the famous flour sack acting test. And you might not know or think for a glance that there's much Renaissance art going on here. But if we overlay the hips and the shoulders over the flour sack, you'll see some poses have a little of the principle and some have quite a lot. So the hero pose here has a very subtle example. The hips are facing us better, but the shoulders are definitely twisting away more so. A good example of a more dramatic counterpose here on the walk. And as you can see, the foot at this side is coming right toward us, while the shoulder at this side is coming towards us. This also twists the spine or the line of action of the character. And another extreme one here is the waves pose, where I've twisted it almost as much as the previous Renaissance sculpture did. And another good twist here, or torque, on the sneak pose. So that's the basic idea. And here we can see how we can apply it with varying degrees of subtlety. So we have our essential zero pose figure on the top left, standing straight on with little or no counterpose. On the third pose here, we've begun to add a little bit. And look what happens. We have a much more believable standing position. The fourth figure on the top row, in a big anticipation to a very jaunty walk. And you can see ghosted in the hips and the shoulders. And so you can see immediately how useful this is in generating good, strong, believable poses. On the bottom left here, we have a baseball player throwing. And as you can see again, here we have one pose where the throw is very, not so much a counter pose, so much as a kind of a twist here on the shoulders. But on this one, we have a very good counter pose as the shoulder follows through the action. And now we can see a very strong dynamic throw action. And of course, again, the walk cycle. Walk cycles are full of these kind of counterpose where we have the ball sockets of the shoulder and the hips, and they're rotating left and right and up and down opposite to one another. So as you can see, this is a great principle to apply even to a static image. Like if you're drawing comics or a cartoon, never mind animating, you absolutely should be looking for excuses to apply this. Yet more examples, because I don't think you can see enough. So as you can see again, especially with these really exuberant, strong action poses, absolutely vital that you're trying to apply counterpose or torque to the character. So I'll just end with some animated examples so you can see how this begins to apply when you actually move it. And as you can see, it really creates a lot of charm, even at the very basic, simple level here. And it gets us out of that awful zero pose territory when we have a lot of animation begin scenes with characters in a very boring, poker pose where he's just like basically a poker. He's just a vertical broom. So you should try to avoid setting up scenes like that. Always try to start a scene with a character in something more interesting like this, and not so much in, like I said, a zero pose like that. And again, another example, and this working from a zero pose into a nice counter pose. So that's a basic introduction to counterpose or torque, also known as contrapposto if you're a Renaissance painter. So I hope that's useful to you. Let's take a look at how we apply counterpose or torque to an inanimate object. In this case, it's sort of a coffee mug or some cylindrical object. So one thing that's nice to do is to treat the object as though it was made out of flesh and bone. And in this case, I've done that by adding some counterpose. If we overlay hips and shoulders on top of the object, you can see that I've begun just doing it. We're twisting and torquing as best as we can with such a simple form. But even with something as simple as this, we can do it. Especially here, you can see I'm tilting the shoulders away from the hips here too, and here also. As you can see, when we animate the object, we're getting a very nice sensation that we're looking at a living thing. So again, this is creating the illusion that we're looking at a living creature, not just a cylinder. And of course, we can do this with many objects. In this case, a slightly more complex one, a broom. And the bristles of the broom are the de facto legs. And, at first glance, it looks all well and good, and it is. But the one reason why is we have many principles at play here. But one of them is I'm using counterpose on the legs, on the bristles, to create the illusion that we're looking at something with anatomy. It's not just an amorphous group of straw. It's actually, in my imagination, those are legs. So we treat them like legs. We add sort of imaginary or implied hips, and these move. Even though there are no shoulders, we can still move them relative to the shaft, the wooden pole that's holding them in place. So as you can see, the end result is feeling like a little Cossack with big pants. It looks like it's an actual living creature. Now, of course, as I've mentioned in other movies, this also applies to living creatures, not just to objects. I've done a previous course on attitude walk cycles, and this is a great example of using counterpose. The more counterpose usually with this kind of action, the better, because we're trying to put emotion into these walk cycles. So if I overlay just very quickly, just a couple of examples of counterpose throughout these actions, you'll see what I mean. So we have the blue representing the right side, and you can see how it's twisting opposite to the hip and the shoulder. And we can really push this to quite a big extreme. And there's really no limit. I mean, you can really twist it even further than this if you wanted to. So very important that you try to add opposing action, especially to violent actions like attitude walks and run cycles. So the previous thumbnails that I was showing you look like this when they're put into practice. So they certainly feel, I could certainly push these more if I was to do another version. I would like to, can I make it even more extreme? But as you can see, they're already feeling like they're breaking well out of the basic, boring, standard walk cycle that we're all familiar with. Another good example would be trying to do a more loose animation, something like a drunken or a dizzy walk. So in this case, we're usually trained to make our figures look like they're in balance or reasonably centered. With something like a stumble or a drunken stagger, then the idea would be to try to keep the figure out of balance and struggling to get back into balance. One technique you might use for that would be to really accentuate the counterpose, to really push the figure into these extreme actions. And again, try to give him as little time off balance before he blunders back into balance before falling back out of it again. So in this case, I was really twisting some of these poses, especially this one. Look at this one here. That is a very big twist from one side to the other. So that, again, is a practical tool that can also be used for these certain specific cases. This is an animation I did for a very early course on how to do hand-drawn animation inside Flash, the program now known as Adobe Animate. And it's a very nice little spin that the character does. But if we overlay the counterpose, you'll see really nice examples of how we're twisting the hips and the shoulders relative to one another. And it creates a very nice, loose action. So that's what he looks like if we apply all of those techniques to this particular scene. It's very important to really loosen up the figure from pose to pose. So it's certainly got that nice zippy feeling to it. It's sparkly. So here's my wizard animation, and let's let him play a couple of times. And then if we overlay the opposing action on top of that scene, it's quite subtle. This is a really subtle example in comparison to the spin, but you'll see even something as subtle as this allows us to break apart the idea that this is a static drawing. And now when we see the final color animation, it looks nice and classical. So that's the basic principle of counterpose or torque, and how you can apply it to anything from a simple cylindrical character to a fully animated Golden Age style animated wizard. I'd like to talk about overlapping action and follow through, which seem a bit cryptic of all the principles of animation. It's like, what on earth is this overlap thing? So let me show you a simple action with four pieces of fabric suspended from a little bar or a pole with no overlap or follow through. So as you can see, each one of these pieces of fabric or scarf or whatever these are, they move at exactly the same time. But what happens if we overlap the timing on the furthest one? So we make it a heavier material. We've changed its material properties somehow. So it's a bit heavier, weightier. Maybe it's wetter. It's been damp. It hasn't dried out right. So it moves a little more slowly. It's not quite so light. So we can continue this process. Now with the second from the furthest, it now has a slightly different material property from the others. So the one on the closest to us is now, and the one beside that move fastest, then the red one, and then the one furthest from us. We continue the process. And now all four pieces are overlapping. They're all moving at different speeds, and the result is something that feels much more natural. If you were to move a curtain, for example, to open it, the entire thing would not stop moving at the same time. There would be different folds that would reach their end point at different times as it compresses, as it accordions to a stop. So here's the entire thing now in white, so you can really get a feel for it. So this is the principle of overlap and follow through. The timings overlap and then they all move through and settle at different times. We're going to extend and expand upon this throughout future movies, so you'll see different examples of how this can be applied. And this is probably one of the hallmarks of a more sophisticated animator. Once you begin to master this kind of principle, that's when your work really starts looking like the real thing. This is an animation I did for a course on secondary animation dealing with hair and clothing. And it's a nice example of how to plot these extremely intricate hair shapes, especially the kind of characters that you see in classic Disney or Warner Brothers or Don Bluth style movies. But the one thing about it is, one of my students pointed out on LinkedIn's website, on the forum there, on the feed there, is that they all come together at the same time. And so it does lack a certain kind of natural movement. And that's absolutely true. That was deliberate. There was more than enough to be worried about plotting all the arcs and making sure that all the bits moved. But the thing that's really going to push this into a higher level of subtlety and quality is the application of overlapping action so that they don't all arrive at the same time. So let's get rid of all the arcs in that business. And now we're going to apply some very subtle overlapping action. And suddenly the hair no longer seems to move as though it's one single entity. I'm going to stop this and pause it right here and go through very slowly. And you'll see one by one, different parts come to rest at different times. It's not really very blatant, it's quite subtle, but it's enough just to soften that harsh, artificial feeling. Now, of course, to animate this kind of thing, this subtlety requires a great deal more effort. So let me show you a full character example. So I've animated this classic style wizard to demonstrate the different principles of animation. And in this case, I want to focus on the principle of overlap and follow through. So let's watch the scene first. Looks really nice. And now I'm flashing in blue all the body parts that come to a rest at different times. So he doesn't just come screeching to a stop on frame 31. The different parts come to a stop at different times. So again, we'll watch him in color. And now what I'm going to do is go through frame by frame. So the face and the hand stop on that point, then the beard and the right hand, then the belly stops moving, then the sleeves stop moving, and I think last is the rope, because the rope was the lightest, the most susceptible to being swung back and forth. As you can see, those offsets are very close together. They all happen within the space of 6 or 7 frames. That 6 or 7 frame overlap is sufficient to take this character out of the world of TV animation and into the world of quality feature style animation. So if this is the kind of look and feel that you want in your work, then this is the kind of thing that you must strive for. I would start out simple and work up with more complexity, because it does mean adding more extreme actions on different parts of the costume and the character. But in my experience, it's been well worth it. And it was one of the most important things that I learned in my career. Let's take a quick look at perspective. And this is a cursory introduction to the topic. And it's not the kind of thing that as an animator you may have to worry about if you're dealing with characters, but you should still know what it is and how it applies to your scenes. So in this example, we have the horizon line, the black line right across the middle, the horizontal line, and then the vertical and diagonal lines are converging on the vanishing point. And this vanishing point can move around. So let's just play this animation and see. So we can have the horizon low on the ground. This gives us a worm's eye view. Now we're low down looking up. There's more sky than ground. We can have the opposite, which is a bird's eye view. So if you're going to do a shot where we're flying over lots of terrain, the horizon goes to the top of the screen. The most common is the 1/3 from the bottom, and this is the most pleasing. When the horizon line is at the halfway point, it can look like a Union Jack. It's a little bit artificial. Sometimes we use those kind of shots, but they're not that common. And we can keep the horizon line at that level, but we can compose the shot around the vanishing point to one side or the other side. And we can also move it around to different points on the screen. So we have all these different options that give us great flexibility. We can also tilt the camera. So here we're tilting the camera to the left and here to the right. Back again at the Union Jack. Now I'm going to show you some shots very quickly to give you an idea about the difference this makes to your background and the kind of shots that are produced from different horizon lines. So this is a nice example of a Union Jack. It's a very quick storyboard thumbnail sketch that I did set in the cafe. The two characters are talking. I want it to be completely relaxed and stable and very centered. And it's also nice that we have the diner staff behind them right in the middle of the Union Jack, because they are being watched as they talk. And here's a nice example of a cityscape. If you're going to do like a New York type city environment, it's nice, very typically, to see all the big buildings. This would be great for an establishing shot to set up your scene. And of course, as I said before, the bird's eye view. So if our characters have broken down on the long highway, this is perfect to set up that scenario, that predicament for them. And the classic, most balanced 2/3 or the 1/3 from the bottom is great for like domestic scenes or these kind of like, it's still an establishing shot, but it's much closer in. When we move the vanishing point off to one side, and here you'll notice that the vanishing point is now here, we get the classic Don Bluth style dynamic composition, which we would see a lot in the old Dragon's Lair and Space Ace games. It creates a really, really powerful environment. Same kind of technique, more mundane setting, a bus stop, but you can see we still get this really beautiful, very pleasing composition of the scene. Again, the 1/3 from the bottom, great for an interior, for a cubicle farm. Another one of our dynamic angles, again, great for a very easy to look at establishing scene of the city, because it just takes in the entire panorama. And another example, and again, more of like a medium shot at this point. And again, great sense of dynamism. So putting the vanishing point down at one of these corners here or here is a really nice way. If you find that your backgrounds are becoming a little static, or you're composing your scene and it looks a little dull. Another 1/3, which is a beautiful establishing shot again of a San Francisco type city, very calm. Again, the 1/3 tends to give us compositions I find that are very calm, relaxed, more pleasing. Move the horizon line up to a 2/3 and we get a nice down shot. This is kind of a long shot of again, the cafe interior. We rotate and tilt. Now we're looking up at the sky. The Martian robots are coming. So we tilt to the other side and the Martians are coming for us. So as you can see, by getting these different perspectives and different vanishing points, and also don't forget, occasionally we can rotate the camera, we have now the ability to begin to plan out and think about what kind of camera view do we want and what kind of shot are we trying to aim toward. I want to give you a quick example of perspective and how peculiar it can be. So in this case, we have two telegraph poles on a road on a big horizon, and I want you to guess where the telegraph pole that will be exactly halfway between these poles will be. So an old art director that I used to work with gave me a hint for how to find it, which is, well, the dotted line is basically what a power line would be between them. So it's, again, pointing exactly toward the horizon line here. You draw an X between each corner, and in the midpoint, that is where the second or the halfway point will be. So this is obviously going to be important when you're animating objects moving toward the camera. You can't, it's very difficult to gauge precisely where the halfway point would be. It's usually a little further back than you always imagine. And of course, the same principle applies to the ones between those. So you can then apply the same point. And again, this pole here is much further back than you would imagine, and so on. So if we continue to subdivide, you get the idea. So what I've done here is animated 3 spheres coming toward the camera, 1, 2, and 3, at various speeds. The first one is the red one, which is shot by in about 7 frames, at about the speed of a car going what feels to me like 120 miles an hour. And the next one is the purple one, and that's going half that speed. And the yellow or orangey one is about 30% slower still. So as you can see, they zip past the camera at an incredible rate. So this is just to show you the importance of gauging depth, especially if you want kinetic power, if you want your animation to feel like it's coming at the camera with real force. So remember the perspective illusion and how you might correct for it. One thing that becomes really important when you animate a cycle is to make sure the arc patterns are really good. Now, the arcs are always important, but with cycles, they're really important because you're looping this over and over again. So what I want to do is show you how I plotted arcs for this walk. And this is an animation I did from my previous course on walk cycles. So some of you may be working in CGI programs for the plot arcs for you, where you can switch on the various points of the body and you can see where the parts are coming from. Others might not. Other people might be working with puppet systems that don't do that. So what I usually do in that case, or if I'm drawing by hand, I'll put a clean sheet of paper or a layer over the original animation and pick a point and then plot that point. And you'll see what I mean after this. So this is the contact pose, and that's frame number 1. So I'd simply draw a dot with the frame number on it. And then I proceed to track that dot and write down the frame number. And then after 3 or 4, you can usually begin to plot the arcs. So you can see immediately that when I come to do frames 5 and 6, they should really be somewhere on this path and not here. And had I in between them straight, that would have looked really, really ugly. So we simply proceed to move through the rest of the animation. And then you can see that we have a very nice loop-the-loop there. And that'll cycle on to the next part of the walk. So it even works very nicely with the repeat. So this loop here is the same as this loop here. Now that's what it's going to look like when it tracks across the screen. And then we can also plot the in-betweens. Now, if you're thinking, good grief, this is a lot of work, you're right, it is a lot of work. This is what it takes to take your work up a notch, to get it out of the realm of staggered TV style animation and move it toward feature style animation. And when we used to draw these on hand on features, this is what a lot of us did. We would have these little arc loops and a second sheet of paper that had all these little plots on them. Same thing goes for the right elbow. If you look at the right elbow plot, that's it. You don't have to do this for every single body part, but there are certain key parts, elbows and wrists, sometimes the nose, sometimes a knee or a foot. Here's the left wrist. That's, again, a very nice soft loop. That's not going to catch the eye. Notice also that we're easing in and easing out, so there aren't any sudden slow ins and slow outs going on that would also catch the eye. Notice also that we're plotting the velocity of these body parts as well, so we're not suddenly having a lot of frame sticking and stacking up in one point and causing jaggy motions. So the speed is also being accounted for by these points. And here you can see the end result. Look at the arms and look at the elbow, and there's nothing there that's jumping out and popping or snapping. So that's how you plot arcs, and we'll be dealing more with plotting arcs in future movies. I want to take another look at arcs and plotting arcs because this is kind of a special case when you do like a front-on walk cycle. You want a walk cycle to be symmetrical. It has to look the same left and right, or it'll have a limping quality to it. And this is again from a previous course I did on walk cycles. So let's just plot the point of the front arm and we'll just map it through. And as we go from key to key, you can see we have a really beautiful loop. And this is called a figure 8. And it's not obviously a perfect number 8, but you get the idea. The thing crosses over itself. And you can move in feature style animation through series of these looping figure 8s, and you're almost spinning them through 3D space. That's how you think of it. So that is the famous figure 8 loop. And you should be trying to create these if you want to get really nice, smooth animation. It's one of the techniques that we would use to get that really rich 1930s, 1940s feature style look. And again, we can plot the in-betweens on here so we can check out to make sure that our velocities are more or less sensible, that we're not suddenly, clustering a lot of frames around a point here where we should be swinging fast and spacing the in-betweens wide. So we have a nice spacing, nice velocity. Doesn't have to be geometrically perfect in the sense that CGI animation usually is. You can be a little bit cheaty with some of these, but as long as you're not really bunching up 7 or 8 frames up here, you should be on good territory. And it has to be symmetrical. So this is the important thing about front-on cycles, or a cycle that's going to be repeating a lot like this too. You want to match one side to the other as best as you can. So in this case, the right arm and the left arm are exact mirrors of one another. I animated this 2-second scene of a wizard in order to illustrate all of the classical principles of animation. And one of the principles involved in creating this scene and making the scene really look believable was a very rigorous arc plotting system. So let's play the scene and then I'll show you how I plotted the arcs. So I took each body point, the major points, the nose, the point of the beard, the rope, the bottom of the rope, his left wrist, his right wrist, and the point of his hat. And then if we overlay all of these points, you can see that they all work smoothly together. So they don't have to be, I'll just pause here. There's a nice little S-curve loop on the head, and the anticipation will be down here. This is the overshoot, and that's the settle. There's a little tricky thing happening here, and I left it in so that you can see how quickly that goes by. And it reads, in this case, we got away with it, I think. It reads like more of a little whip before it resumes its speed over here. This point here could ideally be brought down a little bit. So there's definitely room for, as there always is, room for some improvement. But again, we'll play this again after you've watched this and see if you can even notice these. So there's a nice little, almost a figure right here. We'll just do this little overshoot, change direction. I don't expect everything to move in perfect geometrical forms. Sometimes you have to make compromises to get a nicer drawing shape. But this is reasonably smooth, and that's not enough to catch the eye, so we can get away with this too. Nice little S-curve on the wrist. Again, anticipate, overshoot, settle. I really like this one. That's a lovely loop. And you can see how he slows out of the up point here, the anticipation. Gain speed is very fast here, which allows me to create a really beautiful stretch on the sleeve. And a nice little spiral on the point of the hat too. Can't go wrong with that. So here they are all together. Now remember the point that was, I think, possibly catching the eye, which I think was the point of the beard. The arcs looked a little funny there, but it moves so fast you can barely notice it. I'll play one more time. There we go. So that again is the crucial point of taking that extra step. You might think, oh no, the last thing I want to do is start drawing little dots over everything. Pick a couple of key points, center of the nose, maybe the wrist, something that's moving fast like the tip of the beard or the point of the hat, and just do a plot. And then maybe do little dots, the tick marks that'll represent all the in-betweens. And you'll find things will jump out at you that you never noticed when you were playing it through in real time. This is a quick introduction to the most common types of shots that you will deal with, because you hear a lot of people talking about establishing shot, long shot, medium shot. So it's a good idea to have a simple idea of what they are. I've seen sites out there that have lists of 50 shots. Too much. The basic vocabulary of shots is fairly straightforward. Most of these images are from a previous course I did on storyboards. Storyboarding isn't relevant to everybody, but shot type should be known by everybody. So this is a typical establishing shot. It could have been even further out, but this was nice enough because I wanted to see the three figures here. This is just a quick sketch of our three characters, so we get to see them in context. They're in a park, beautiful city, maybe San Francisco. We know where the action's about to begin. This is more of a long shot. We can see the full figures of the characters. We can still see a lot of the background. This would be more like a photograph taken with a 35mm or a 24mm lens. So you get to see exactly where we are in the scene. But we also get to see our figures. I can recognize them now as individuals, and I can see what they're doing. Look at the guy on the right. He's seeing something that he doesn't like. A medium shot where we chop off the lower feet. We're now really moving in closer, but we can see the whole body. There's enough room for the arms to move around the screen and to do some performing. So this is a very, very common frame. Now we have a close-up where we're looking at usually one character's face. We could squeeze in one or two more, but really the focus here now is on one person. Now we have an extreme close-up, and this is usually on the eyes or the mouth if somebody is screaming, and this is for an extreme emotional reaction. And guess what he's just seen? So this is a point of view shot. We're now inside the eyes of the character and we're seeing what he sees. There are other kinds of shots, like trick shots, like split screen, and all kinds of novelty shots, but the preceding shots are the ones that you're probably dealing with more often, more so than things like this. And there's a different kind of shot that I really like. So in this sequence, and this is again from my storyboard course, the hero of the sequence is a little worker, Bumstead, who is trapped in a dead-end job. And I wanted to show him at his cubicle before he gets summoned by his boss to be fired. And so what I wanted to do was to put some, not drama, but some characterization of Bumstead without loading it up with dialogue. And how I did that was insert shots. Insert shots are just looking around the scene. Stress begone pills, so we know he doesn't enjoy the job. This insert shot then also shows, the fact that he's under extreme pressure. We know he's a family man and he likes a cup of coffee. And little tiny details, we just gaze the camera up and there's a leak in the air conditioning system. So his boss doesn't care very much about maintaining the building. And then we're back to our poor hero. So that's a good use of a different kind of shot that's a little more playful. And keep an eye out, and I think you'll see insert shots. There's certain kind of filmmakers that really like doing them, that are really, really good. They just flesh out the environment and they can give you character details that don't involve 20 lines of dialogue. So these are some finished backgrounds from a wizard animation that I've been working on. It's a little medieval scene. And again, just to give you an idea of, these aren't so much shots as camera angles, because camera angles can be applied to different scenes. I could shoot this from a lower angle, it would still be a medium shot. I could shoot it from a higher angle, it would still be a medium shot or whatever. So this will be like a typical perspective where the horizon line is about 1/3 or just under 1/3 from the bottom of the screen. We can do a down shot looking up. And again, I would still call this a medium shot, even though it's a down shot looking up. And we have an establishing shot looking down. So I'm just throwing these in to give you an idea about some different ways to treat the same background, depending on what kind of performance you want. So this would be a more generic stage for many different scenes. I could reuse this background for multiple scenes. This background is really only good for one shot. But this background would be great for lots of different establishing shots, but I wouldn't be able to see much acting on the character. So again, depending on where you put the camera and how close you put the camera to your characters, it's really going to change how you animate the scene and how the audience perceives the scene. So just keep these different shots in mind. Try to use the right shot for the right scene. In a previous movie, I spoke about different kinds of shots. establishing shots, medium shots, long shots, and so on. So this particular shot is an establishing shot. It shows us the characters in the park and we can see what city they're living in. So what if we want to then add to the shot a camera move? So we could, for example, move from an establishing shot into a long shot or from a long shot into a medium shot simply by moving the camera. Well, let's take a look at the different ways we can do this because there's a couple of different approaches. The easiest one would be to zoom the camera in. Now, if we were doing this in live action, this would simply be like zooming your camera. You turn a little knob on the camera and you zoom in. The problem with doing this is it's flat. All you're doing is magnifying the image and it looks a little bit dull. The alternative is to truck in, and that is to physically move into the shot. Now, in terms of live action, this would be you physically, with your camera, not touching the zoom lens, physically moving on a drone or a helicopter or on foot or on the back of a truck into the shot so that you move closer to it. As a result, you get parallax. Parallax is the difference between the different layers. Now see how the trees are moving closer to us. This tree here is moving further faster. You can really see it on these trees here. This little space between the building and the shrubbery is opening up. So parallax is a much richer way of getting these effects. Now, how you achieve parallax depends on what software you're using. I was using a very simple animation program here. It's all on layers. So I was eyeballing these different layers. I put the trees on one layer, the ground on another layer, the city on another one, and I scale them at different speeds. And that created a really nice, quite believable parallax. So here are the two types of shots side by side so you can see the difference. Cheapo zoom on the left, beautiful tracking shot on the right. The other kind of shot that you will have a lot in animation is the pan, and most of these are horizontal pans. And this is simply a storyboard layout. It's a pose test, so that's why you're not seeing any animation. It's just to prove the concept. And how we used to do these in the days when everything was done on paper and drawn or painted, you would have a very long strip of paper. Some of these pan scenes were very long, and the background painters would have. I remember one guy had a painting or a layout sketch that was 7 feet, 8 feet long. He had a very hard time with that, just physically drawing that amount of paper. It was all over the table. So these days, luckily, you can probably do these on your computer or in Photoshop or some other piece of software. But again, this is how you would set up a pan scene. And in this case, we're tracking the people that are running. They're just running across the screen and we're tracking with them. So it's as if there's a railway track going parallel to the action and we're on that little trolley car filming the action as they run. The other kind of pan will be a vertical pan. And sometimes with a vertical pan, you get a different phenomenon, which can be fun, which is we have our monster attacking the city. We go from the top to the bottom. Let me show you what this looks like in a single image. So were you to look at this in a way that you would never actually do on the movie, you get these fishbowl effects where we have a vanishing point up here and a vanishing point down there, and everything is distorted like a super wide angle lens. But what happens is when we play the scene by itself, we never actually see the full thing. So what we perceive is actually a more believable camera shot. So it's just another phenomenon to keep an eye out for. If you get one of these shots, don't be afraid to play with your perspective. Now I'll talk about different ways to transition between different shots. There aren't that many ways you can go from one shot to another, but it's important to know the main ones. So this will be the first time you open up, you watch a movie or you cut to a new sequence. It's a fade in from black usually. Occasionally people will use fade from white. The TV show 6 Feet Under loved to do fade to white when people died. That was a different way of using the same technique, but it's a fade. And it means some time has passed. We've changed the setting of the story to somewhere new, or we've begun a story. And the other technique is a dissolve. A dissolve often means a short amount of time later. It could be just a moment, or it could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever is relevant to the story. It's also a soft way to transition into the scene rather than a hard cut. This kind of transition is a matching cut. We're going from character to character. I'm really not jumping forward in time. We're following the action from shot to shot. So the professor is trying to explain to the student that the menu isn't the meal. So he licks the menu to teach them that, the name of the food on the menu isn't the food itself. It's a funny little scene. So we want these to match time-wise. We're not jumping forward at all. So the animator who animates from one to the other needs to know these have to hook up precisely. So one scene has to really merge perfectly with the one that follows. So the next kind of shot is a reaction shot, and that's when the student finally understands the lesson and then he reacts. So he jumps up out of the table and it's instant. I just cut to this, like Yahoo, and he's on his feet. I decided to stage this from outside the diner so that we could see not just his reaction, but then the reactions of the other customers in the diner to him. So it's a really strong reaction cut. And we get to even cut away like a little insert cut now to the chef or the cook and the waitress as the student then begins to jump around the place with glee. Another kind of shot that I like is the insert shot because it can be very funny. So in this case, the student is kind of becoming a little exuberant and people think he's lost his mind. So he's jumping around the diner, harassing the other patrons, telling them all the stuff he knows now. And this is the insert shot. So we just show the chef is frying some eggs. And I wanted these to look like a bit of a face, like his brain has been fried by too much information. So then we do the wide shot and we see, at this point, the chef is calling the police. And then the police come and they haul him away. So and then we can fade out. This is then a fade out, end of sequence. So at this point, we either end the movie if it's a really sad movie, or we'll have to fade in or a jump cut into the next sequence when some time will have passed and hopefully he's back out and free. So another kind of cut is a jump cut. We could follow all the preceding material that you've seen. He jumps to his feet, he starts lecturing people, and then we just cut to that. We can also jump forward in time and we don't have to step through all the intermediate pieces. So depending on how a scene is cut, you can change the comedy factor. Some jump cuts are really funny. So don't feel like you're married to a particular hard matched cut narrative. Very often the cheat cut could be funnier than going through a lot of the business. It depends from project to project. So try to be flexible. So this is my wizard animation. I use this character to illustrate lots of different principles of a traditional animated scene. So in this case, I'm going to use him to illustrate staging because this was my basic staging of the character. But I didn't have to animate this scene from this direction. I could have picked different camera angles. Why did I pick this camera angle? So let's find out. So again, this is the camera angle I decided to invest most of my time in. And I spent quite a bit of time on the background, probably a few days at least, drawing all of this stuff. The reason being, I can reuse this background for many different shots. And it's also the best angle to illustrate that particular action. So I could also have done this angle. It's much more dramatic, much more cinematic. And we're talking here now about staging the scene. Where do we put the camera and the characters in relation to the background to best communicate what's happening? This would definitely have been a more cinematic shot, but again, a one-off, very tricky angle. I still think the more maybe everyday angle gives us a much better sense of what's going on. So even though this has more perspective, I think it's not the right angle for me. I could also have animated that turn from this direction, but again, the figure's so small. How would I even see all that nice little business? It would be just hidden at this little postage stamp down here in the corner. So again, this would be a fine shot if I were showing where the figure was coming from. If I wanted to animate him walking, toward the magic shoppy, then I would have maybe used this angle. So it depends on what you want to communicate with the given scene. So again, we're in the world of staging. Let's look at a really simple example. And this is the kind of thing you see a lot in TV animation. I call it zero pose staging, where people just pull the character puppet or the rig and drop it on the stage, hands down by the sides, and everyone starts gabbing and chatting at one another. And it's so boring. It's really hard to describe. So let's see how we can begin to break it up. But first, this is like the full screen. So we have our three figures. Uh, Little guy on the left starts to explain some plan he has, and the dog listens but doesn't really believe him. So that's it. So let's take the first pose and see how we can improve the staging. Without moving the camera, we can immediately break these characters out of those awful zero poses and begin them in a pose that already has attitude. So we're trying to give these figures personality. The body language of this character says, I don't believe you from the beginning. We don't have to work him into this difficult pose. We begin him in that pose. And we have the wisecrack, wiseacre, smart talking dog now with a little, even the little touches like the cross leg, hand on hip. He is going to be difficult to convince of anything. Then we cut, instead of this shot, we change it to this angle. So we completely move the camera. We've orbited the camera around over the shoulder of the figure explaining. So instead of seeing his face, we see their face instead. Look at the dog laughing. So even with this little thumbnail napkin sketch that I've done, you can see there's some kind of interaction going on here, which we didn't see in this. And then this was the original dog pose. Instead of that, let's just give him something much more interesting. Again, a zero pose or that, which is going to be more fun to look at. So now instead we have the top row. That was the original zero pose staging. On the bottom, we've begun with the same camera angle, but again, punched up the poses. And we've kept the same camera angle at the end, but again, punched up the pose. And in the middle, we've moved the camera. One reason why this is so lazy at the top, the camera really hasn't moved. All I've done is zoom it in a little bit. So this kind of thing is just got no texture. This has texture. This is interesting. This has some kind of personality. These guys are thinking. We can see them thinking. This is what animation is supposed to be about. In addition to that, we can take poses that might be completely acceptable and just push them a little bit more. Like these two guys clearly have a dynamic. Again, we can see this guy thinking and this guy trying to persuade him, but maybe we can just nudge this a little more. So let's just push him forward. And now we've plussed or we've increased, we've enhanced the tension a little bit. So this might be a better place to start. We could start from here and work into this, but what if we just start here and just really just begin with everything dialed up, and we can even go further. So we can move into something like this, or even start from this if you really, again, want to make the guy on the right look like he's maybe a little bit untrustworthy here. So that's the procedure of staging scenes. Think about how the characters relate to the background, the environment, the camera, and how it relates to the characters, to try to find the best angle to communicate that. So, for example, here I would even move the camera in really close to a medium shot to about this viewpoint here. That would be a really nice framing for that kind of shot. Basic staging. So that's it. Try to think about what's the right angle, the right staging for your scene. All of the images in this movie are from my previous course on storyboarding, but I do want you to at least have a basic idea about camera angles and what they tell us about the character. Even if you're not into storyboarding per se, it's good to be aware of this stuff. And storyboarding and camera angles and staging are really about not just showing what's happening, but communicating more about the emotional content, the inner lives of the characters, how they relate to one another, and maybe where the story is going. And shot selection and positioning of the camera is really important in this. It's not enough just to slap down a camera and show what's happening. We can go a bit beyond that. So in this case, the fact that our little employee here, Bumstead, is physically smaller than his boss, Happy Harry, this employer that he's going to work for, tells us something. Even without Happy Harry's very disturbing expression, we would still know that, there's a power dynamic here, and that for the moment, the employee Bumstead is on the wrong end of it. And, we have the perspective, which we can put the perspective on the other side too if you want, but as long as the eye line, the horizon line is low, it means we're looking up and we're down with Bumstead looking up at the maniac boss. I follow this through many of the boards that I did where we keep Bumstead physically lower. Again, the horizon line is low. It's about here. We're looking up at the boss. I even backlit the boss just to give him, with these horrible fluorescent lights. So he's backlit, makes him look really more menacing. He's physically bigger. I've scaled him up. in a way that he isn't really physically that bigger than Bumstead, but I made him bigger anyway for comic effect. Here's a good example of doing it wrong. This is Bumstead dwarfing the boss, and how would you go about fixing this? A couple of ways. You simply change the framing. You pull Bumstead down. So in this case, he's clearly in trouble. He's still smaller than the boss now. He's moved just slightly below him, but not by much. Like his head is here, the boss is about there. But we can push this even further. Depending on how far you want to go with this, again, we're working in animation. We're working in a medium that should be allowing us to make these kind of silly but very powerful statements. So don't feel forced to be literally correct if you can be more true to the spirit of what's going on in the situation and communicate to the audience visually, not with dialogue. You should be able to communicate to the audience visually, even with the sound down. They should know what's going on. And other kind of framing devices you can do, and I think this was inspired by Mr. Robot, the TV show, which loves this kind of composition. It's, I think, to show that the characters are really out of place, uncomfortable, overwhelmed by the world. They're just completely being displaced by these awful empty rooms. The other thing that you can do with composition is dynamics. So this shot isn't necessarily teaching us anything about the power relationships, but it's certainly allowing us to see what's going on. And again, by moving the horizon low, it enabled me to get this really nice shot and squeeze in a lot of visual information. And this is more like physical content. We know where they are. They're at the bus stop. I wanted to get the bus stop in. I wanted to get the diner. And I wanted to get the police who are carrying away the young man who has just basically lost his mind for a moment. So the shot incorporates all of that. That would have been much harder to do, or at least harder to do well, had I moved the horizon line up. Another example of dynamics. So this is, like a cityscape, and I've added a little fallen power line just to give some visual interest. And again, this splits the space up into these nice triangular pizza sliced wedges, which are much more interesting to look at. And the fact that we have this single point perspective down here that's radiating out toward the viewer gives us a beautiful path that our figure can run down toward the camera. So again, the scene has to communicate, in this case, the brute physical action of the robot chasing the hero, and the rest should be, at this point, self-explanatory in that shot. There's one more thing that I want to point out, and that is in Western cultures, we read from left to right, but in other cultures, it's common to read from right to left. This affects how you read a screen. And many times in Japanese comics, they have to be flipped from left to horizontally, or otherwise they don't read as well. And many Western comics have violent, fast action, like punches moving from the left of the screen to the right. That's only because we're habituated to read from one or the other. So in this case, I'm assuming the audience is in the West, in which case we have the robot coming in from the left side. What are we going to see first? The robot. You're going to look at, most often than not, all things being equal, unless there's some reason in the previous scene, you might track the scene more often from left to right than vice versa. So given that the main action is going to be fast, I think it'll read more smoothly from here to here. Now, look what happens when I flip it. The first thing we notice now is Bumstead, or at least the first thing I noticed was Bumstead sneaking in here. So it does affect, to some very subtle degree, maybe only a few frames, which part of the action you notice first. So it's worth remembering if you want to kind of tease the audience or just do a very subtle cut so that we want to see this happen before that. You can also change the timing, of course. You can have the robot come in later if you want. But if you're going to do these sudden cuts, it's just very, very fine level of detail that you might want to be aware of. And this is just another example of how we can use staging to communicate emotion. This is no more than a little cubicle farm, but by staging it from a bird's eye view, we look down at the characters, we make them physically smaller, we make them homogeneous so they all look like they're doing the same thing at the same time. I'm not having them lolling around, drinking coffee, having fun. They're all glued to their chairs. So again, I'm using the storyboard to communicate the psychology of the characters and the predicament of the characters to try to make us invested in their emotional lives. And that's what staging and storyboarding and animation is about. I'm always amazed when I see one of the most basic mistakes made in major Hollywood movies and TV shows that a person could make, and that's crossing the line, sometimes called the line of action or the line of the camera. Let me show you what that is. So, if we have a character moving toward a direction or speaking to another character, we imagine an imaginary line connecting them. So, in this case, the figure is moving from left to right along this imaginary red line. So that's the line of action, or sometimes called the line of the camera. So you do not, unless there's a very good reason to cross that line, you set up your cameras or your storyboard panels on one side or the other. So let's show you what happens when we break this rule. So this is the character shot from the A camera, and this is him shot from the B camera. Now imagine that I cut from one to the other and back again. This is the kind of effect you're going to get. Which way is he running? You can't even tell. When this is done often enough, you simply lose track of the action. You can't follow who is moving where or who is talking to whom. So the solution is pick a side. Just pick one side and stick to it. And you can get a vast number of camera angles from one side or the other. So here's a more complex example. This is from my storyboard course, which if you want to follow this kind of thing in more detail, there's plenty of material there on this. But what I did was I set up a robot and our hero. And again, the red line is the line of action. The A side is the flat side, which is the cratered landscape. On the B side is the city. On the left column, you see with the green frames, 4 different shots taken from the A camera. On the right side, 4 different shots taken from the B camera. So were I to cut between these different shots, I would just choose one or the other. Pick one and live with it. So whichever one you think looks best. I think that the one with the ruined city looks best because it's got a ruined city in it. But this one, these are all really great choices of shots. I mean, you have so many choices that you can cut between. From this side here, again, you have all these different angles from low to high, down shots, over the shoulder shots. It's not as though you're limited in any way by being stuck on one side or the other of the line. And again, a good example, if you stay on one side of the line, then your character will be on one side of the screen from shot to shot. The hero will be on the left, the robot on the right, and from cut to cut to cut, we can follow easily what's going on. These are all great transitions from here to there. They're easy to follow. If I cross the line, look what happens. Look at the human on the left, and now he turns into a robot. And if we go back again and do that often enough, it'll really confuse the audience. So now we're on one side of the line, and as you can see, 8 different shots, great variety of camera angles. We can just have the hero by himself. We can have the robot by himself talking to the hero. We can have these dramatic upshots. So again, pick a side and stick to it. And then as we cut from one to the other, these look great. One of the strongest techniques that you can use when you want to loosen your animation is to break joints. And this is a really good example of a very simple joint break, and it's happening right on the elbow. Let me pause the frame. About here, that's our broken joint. So on the second frame, that's the first break of the joint. And as you can see on the third image, it breaks again to restore itself back to the original natural orientation. And so you get 2 breaks for the price of 1, basically, usually every time you do this, you'll break and then settle back again. So just to show you what this looks like if we overlay these frames. And here I've also shown you a very common technique that I use when I'm plotting these out on paper. And also sometimes if I'm working in Flash, Adobe Animate or Harmony or some other program like that, it's always good to plot the arcs on a different layer above the original animation. And you can see again, we have a beautiful arc path. And the ticks show frame numbers. So we have the keyframes on 1, 9, and 15, and the in-between frames on 3, 5, 7, 11, and 13. And of course, we have the final settle into frame number 23. So again, that's the final animation. There's another thing that you can do as well. If you feel that these kind of things are catching the eye, maybe it's something that you want the viewer to feel rather than see, then we can always increase the speed. And so here I've moved some of the breaking process onto a much faster timing. And this is the kind of thing you should play with to see if it works for you or not. And in this case, you can barely see those broken joints. They're still there. All the animation frames are still there, but now it's moving so fast. All you can really sense from this is looseness. That's a loose animation. And it helps to break away from the kind of stiff work that you will begin to do if you're a beginning animator or you want to move on to a higher level. When I began to do walk cycles many years ago, I found that the very first few walks I did were fairly boring and standard. You're familiar with the basic walk cycle by now, I'm sure. So I always wanted to break out of that and do walks that had a bit more personality and were more interesting. So in this case, I've done something like that with the lower part of the body and pushed the legs. So let's see how we've achieved this effect. So here we have the basic contact positions of a typical walk cycle. And I've covered walk cycles before, both the typical walk cycle and attitude walks in previous courses that are in the library. And I strongly recommend you watch those if you want to go into like real detail with this. But let me show you a very quick and dirty way to snap out of the basic straightforward walk. So in this example, I pushed the passing position, which is the pose halfway between the contacts, and I broke the knee joint. And there's a little tilt forward on the body happening here. That's a good thing to do as well, just to have a bit of flexibility. But this here, this broken knee, snapping from this angle to the opposite angle, that's what creates that sense of flexibility and attitude in this walk. Of course, we do the same thing on the other side. And again, we have this very strong knee position up here. These would be very difficult walks to achieve in real life, if not maybe impossible. So this is the beauty of animation, that we can create walks and motions that are basically fantastical, but yet are believable. So here again, we have the poses, and I'll just show you the down position and the down position, the up position and the up position. So that gives you an idea of the range of motion that I built around those contact poses and the passing poses. And again, there's the walk that we achieve as a result. So these are the images of the walk cycle, the most important being the contacts and the passing positions. I'm just showing you these as visual reference. So if you want to attempt to create your own version of this, I would use these as a good, strong visual reference. And these are our low points and our high points. And now I've put them on the transparency so you can get a better idea of the positions of the various body parts, the arms and the legs and so forth against one another. I've pulled them apart slightly as well for clarity so you can see them a little more easily. Also, one quick note, my frame rate is 24 frames per second. That's why a complete step, as you can see here, this is the complete, all the in-betweens as well on ones. So we're going from 1 through frame 13. That's half a second. If you're working on a 30 frame per second rate, then my number 13 will be your number 16. So it'll be a little bit further, or 15 or 16 or close to that. And this is the second half of the walk, which brings us through to the conclusion of the cycle. So that's it. That is a technique, breaking of joints, which again, we can see happening through the leg here, broken. And then a very nice, exaggerated comic step right the way through to complete the walk cycle and to get you out of the prison of doing very stiff walks. In a previous movie, I showed you how to create really flexible walks with attitude by breaking joints. One of the things that will happen whenever you do any animated scene is that you really have to control arcs, timing, and spacing. So what I'm going to do is to show you how I made sure that the legs on this very exaggerated walk didn't catch the eye, because they're moving a lot. And we wanted to make sure that that movement is pleasing to look at. So I've overlaid the frames here of the main drawings, the contact, the low point, the passing, and the high points, so you can see them exactly as they are overlaid on top of one another. So how I plot joints is basically, back in the day, we would have used paper and pencil. And one technique that many animators use was to get a clean sheet, place it over the animation, and plot out each body part with dots. So let me show you what this looks like if we do this on a computer. So we basically pick a point like the tip of the nose, and we plot that throughout all of the keys. And if we've done it correctly, we get these beautiful arc paths, and we just continue that on as the cycle goes. So we can do this process for every body part. In this case, his physical right wrist. And as I plot each drawing through, I can see that we have a very beautiful arcing path. Notice that there is like a crescent shape here. That's okay. That's the top point of the arc path swinging, and then it's not a problem for that to swing back there. But the rest is a really nice loop. It's actually beautiful to look at purely as an arc path, as a design. Same thing for the other arm, which will have a different path. And when we overlay all the paths, you get something like this. What you don't want to have is usually one frame out here creating a square line, or up here creating a weird bump. Those tend to catch the eye. And if you continue to plot all the body parts throughout your scene, you should be seeing roughly things like this. Also notice these dots. They also give you the timing, which is the keyframes, and the spacing. So you can plot out where the in-betweens are going to go. So here, number 2, 3, and here, these little dots here are in-betweens, 6 or 5, 6, I think. But if you plot these right the way through, you'll see that the acceleration and deceleration is going to be good. We're not seeing clusters where there shouldn't be any. So for example, here the arm is swinging very fast, and as you would expect, these dots are further apart. If I was seeing them bunching here, here, and here, that is going to be a sudden cessation of motion, and that will catch the eye. It will look really bad. So in this case, I can see I got nice gathering at the top of the arc patterns, and I could go into even more detail than this. But at first glance, this is going to be a very nice looking scene. And now, having seen those arc paths, you can maybe have an idea for overlaying them in your imagination on top of the tip of the nose, the near arm, the far arm, and so on. So it's the kind of thing that's very easy to forget to do, and I strongly recommend you find some way, regardless of whether you're animating on paper, Flash, Animate CC, Harmony, or some other 3D program, always watch or make visible your arc paths and your spacing and timing. It's really important, if you do a drawing that you like, not to settle for it, because there may be something that you can do to that drawing to make it even better. Disney had a word for this and he called it plussing. And when the animators showed him a scene, even if it was fine and everybody was happy with it, he would always ask them to plus the scene. Now, obviously, there's no end to this. You could keep plussing a scene forever and paying for that extra quality with the loss of quantity. But a little plussing goes a long way. Let's look at this angry face and see if we can plus it any. So with a little addition of exaggeration or plussing, we've already pushed this to be a much stronger design. And at this point, you might think, well, that's probably as far as we can take this. Let's see if we can bring it any further forward. And as you can see, we certainly can. We're really forcing that now. We're pushing the anatomy to breaking point. And how far can you go? Well, you probably go a little further than this, but maybe there are a limit to this at some point. But in any event, this is the basic principle that you see in the work of the period. Warner Brothers during the Looney Tunes cartoons, Hanna-Barbera with Tom and Jerry, and of course the Disney Studios as well, especially with things like the Goofy shorts. They had a great fun with this. So just so we can see these drawings side by side for easier comparison, there's the 3 states, and of course I in-betweened all the different in-betweens between them. So there's a spectrum or a continuum between these, so you can definitely pick and choose, how far you want to take this principle. So here's a very simple stylized graphical face, more of a 3/4 view. So again, we can see the same principle applied here with obviously a more typical angle. And again, we can push it much further indeed. So that's the final end state of this guy. He's looking kind of scary at this point. And again, I'll just walk you through the 3 main poses. So as you can see, it's the same character, the same model. We're just adding more anatomy, more lines, more tension and creases. And there's our states A, B, and C. So never give up on exaggeration or plussing, and always be on the lookout for little things and touches that you can add. In a previous movie, I talked about exaggerating or plussing a face, taking an expression and just pushing it, like how far can I take it? Now, the same principle, of course, applies to body positions, and let's take a look at this. So as you can see here, we have a perfectly acceptable pose. Nobody should have a problem with this. We know the guy is reaching, hands up, he's going to reach down, pick up a flower, something like that. But can we plus this or exaggerate this a little further? And we certainly can. In this case, I'm pushing him further forward, and increasing the line of action. So we have the line of action from his foot right through his head. I've pushed that and increased it much more. And here, even further, now making him look more hungry or aggressive even before he's about to pick this thing up. So if it's a gold coin, for example, this is way more appropriate for that kind of action. It's a little more greedy. And of course, if we go too far, he'll fall down. So again, just to stress, there are limits as to how far we can take this principle, but in this case, we can take it pretty far. Certainly to this point. So just to overlay these different poses for direct comparison, as you can see, we have our 3 poses, the third being extreme, but certainly still in balance. And then obviously this is ridiculous, but maybe there's one further that we could squeeze in somewhere between these two. But again, how much time do you want to sink into something before you become ludicrous? But certainly try to stay somewhere within this range, I think is healthy. But again, avoid falling on the face. So that's the principle of exaggeration. A little goes a long way. Always keep an eye out for it. In previous movies, I spoke about plussing, or sometimes known as exaggeration, which involves taking a scene or an action, an expression, a pose, and adding something extra to it. It doesn't mean that the original scene is bad. It just means that maybe you could use a little extra. Now let's take an example of a good acting scene. So we have a nice little action of this character, and he's doing a little turn and ending up in a little glee pose, like he's just won something. So this is a nice action. It looks good. But how would we take this and plus the scene or exaggerate the scene and add a little bit of extra to it? Let's take a look. So this was the original scene. These are the 4 key poses. And as you can see, it's very simple. He starts left and ends on number 17 on the right. My frame rate for this is 24 frames per second. So if you want to try to copy this at your own frame rate, then you need to add a little few frames. Maybe take it from 17 to 21 would be close enough to the same timing as this. So the green outline is sort of the beginning of the down move or the beginning of an anticipation action. Number 9 is a smear. I'm moving on to wands here, so that's going to be a very fast frame. This should be a reasonably fast turn because he's smearing in a kind of a very cartoony. It's already fairly exaggerated as it is. So let's see how we can take this further. So this is my design for the second pass for the scene. And as you can see, several things have happened. Firstly, an orange outline here, you can see how I've decided to push the expression a little bit more. This you can consider a subtle change. Again, there's no end to how subtle you can make these alterations, but I thought that would be, a stronger eye position to begin in, just to move one slightly down and the other even just detached from the skull in a very cartoony way. And you can see the same thing happening here. On the end pose, I've actually given them teeth. Now this is really going to stand out because that's going to be the end pose and we're going to see that for a few frames. So to end with a big flash of white teeth will certainly be more striking. I did some subtle things too, like on this one here, I decided to drag the fingers on the way down and also drag the eye just a little bit again. And I've added an anticipation pose. So on this anticipation pose on number 9, follow this little line here and you'll see how the head's moving up slightly. Not much, just a little. And same thing with the hands. The hands are also moving up to anticipate the downward movement. And I thought, if possible, to add like a little drag or overlapping action on the hands. It's not always possible at this stage to be sure if this will work, but it's a nice idea to see if you can, as number 11 will move down, that's an in-between into here, if you could somehow bring the fingers or some part of the body up as an opposing action. A little bit of extra drag on the jowls here, and an overshoot on frame 19. And this is basically going further than the final rest position. So we go anticipate, little overlapping action, drag the fingers, a little bit of extra drag on the face, overshoot, and settle. So number 25. This number here is wrong, but this is number 25. And then we settle 27, 29, 31 into 33, slowing in or easing into the final position. So that was it. Let's take a look at it. So this is the plussed scene, and hopefully you can see some of those additions now. So there's some nice stuff happening now. You can see if I pause it here, we anticipate, And we have the overshoot and the settle. So let's put them side by side and see what that looks like. So the timing, of course, is slightly different because I added some extra in-betweens to the exaggerated or the plus version. But as you can see, it feels much richer. Look at the left side, and it's basic and functional. Look at the right side, and you're starting to get that golden age feature animation feel. And those are the qualities that really add. Look at his hands, for example, on the left side, and see how they come snapping to a stop. Clunk, like a machine. Look at the right now, and see how they just softly come together. So even the extra drawings that I've added as in-betweens all work to make the right side just a much higher quality of animation than the left, and even though the drawings are pretty much the same in each scene. And this is the scene with some color added, which is really nice because it's a nice way to see some other little details. For example, the little drag on the jumper, and where it settles as well. Just you can see that little flash of little belly there. So we get the sense of fabric, material reality to it. So there are lots of more details you could continue to add. There's, again, no end to how far you can take this principle of plussing or exaggeration. You could be at it for a long time. So the question is to find what's the quality that you're shooting for and keep applying this principle until you get it. In this movie, I'll apply the principles of anticipation, overshoot, settle, primary and secondary action, and a bit of drag to show you how we can create a nice soft sensation to an otherwise very stiff-looking design. So it's an extremely basic action, and again with a very basic design, from number 1, anticipate on number 7, overshoot on 11, settle on number 19. And my frame rate for this is 24 frames per second. So if you're trying to do this on 30, just go from number 1 to number 8 or 9, and 11 will be 13 and so on. So as you can see on number 7, the anticipation, I've colored it in green so you can see for clarity, the hair begins to drag, and it's a fairly stiff kind of short hair, so it retains its shape very quickly. It recovers very quickly on number 11. So let's have a look at the frames. And again, these are traditional timing charts, so hopefully these will be reasonably sensible to everybody. But this is our first key. We're moving into number 7, and we're easing into it very slightly. So there'll be 2 in-betweens going into this down position. The hair will be dragging on those. And then we'll snap into from number 7 on 2s. So it's 7, 9, 11. So I'm drawing these by hand. So you can put, if it's on 1s, you can draw number 8 here or number 10 there and so on. Anyway, we go into the high point here and then we settle. So there's the 2 keys for the high point and the settle drawing. And there's the drag. So we go from the high point, the overshoot, the drag into the settle. So that's one of the things that gives a little bit of flexibility to the hair. And the other one, of course, is in red here on number 9. And that's where we slam the hair into the head. You know, we're really pushing the design here and squishing it in pretty hard. And that looks like an ugly drawing when seen by itself. But when we overlay them, and again, you can see how the point here is going here, in, and then snapping back into here. Let's take a look again at the animation, and you'll see that now in motion. And there it is. That breaks us out of that hard triangular form. It's a reversal. So when we go from frame by frame, okay, so here we're now reversing into this, and then we snap back into that. So there's a nice reversal from one to the other, from that S curve here into the reverse of that, a C curve there. So it's that reversal also that creates this nice flexible sensation that we're not just dealing with like a stiff triangular wedge, and we know, oh, this is a looser thing than the skull, the nose, and the rest of the face. So again, anticipate the action, overshoot, settle will naturally create these kinds of animations. So it's something to try to add when you're creating something soft like clothing or hair, anything that's going to have a looser characteristic than a hard body part or, you know, metal or a belt or something like that. This simple animation illustrates the basic principle of primary and secondary animation. And as you can see, the head area, the sort of the pumpkin type object, is leading the action. That's doing the motion. And the hat moves only because the head moves. If the head doesn't move, the hat doesn't move. It's that simple. So notice also that the head moves, and then in this case, I've just withheld action on the head very slightly so that it's suspended just for a frame before gravity catches up with it. So it's a very loose-fitting hat in this case. There's also a nice drag as well on the rim of the hat, which also creates the illusion of flexibility with the hat brim. It's like one of those 17th century type wide-brimmed hats. Now notice one other thing about this, that technically the feather is a tertiary or a third action. Its action is determined only because the hat moves, so it has its own little different life from the hat. So in this case we have a primary action, the head, the secondary action, the hat, and a tertiary action, the feather. So here's an example of the timing that I used just to illustrate with some other details to it that are really nice, because certain things happen here as a result of this that really strengthen your animation and make it look more interesting. So first we have the head moving down, and the hat very slowly begins to realize that something has happened. But as the hat pulls this feather point down, notice that the feather opposes the action. It counter-reacts against the action, catches some air, and overshoots. It's an opposing action. It's purely mechanical, but it looks really good when one part of the character moves down and another moves up. On this case, the head begins to move up, but the hat and the feather haven't figured that out yet necessarily, so they're contacting the head. But at this point, the hat and feather are both moving down as the head moves up. This is yet another opposing action. So on this point here, the head continues to move up to the high point here. And again, we have another opposing action as the feather drags. All these nice overlapping types of action basically work together to give a feeling of something that's natural and not mechanical. So it all gathers here at the top before settling into the final end pose. So we have a slow in to the final frame number 23. I changed the design a little bit here too, just to have this little upper part of the rim showing, because it just creates the illusion of flexibility that otherwise this brim of the hat was beginning to feel very stiff, and it just didn't feel very lifelike. So by adding that, I thought, given all the physical abuse this poor hat's gone through, it's entitled to have a little bit of a droop at the end. So there we see it. And as you can see, very simple principle, but easy to understand the essentials of it. The hard part for the animator is becoming comfortable with these various actions and how they relate to one another, because you have the key actions from the head, but you'll have a completely different family of keys for the secondary action, the costumes, the clothing, or any other objects that are trailing along that are acting as a secondary or tertiary to the primary actor, in this case, the head. So it's something that you will learn as you proceed with your career in animation, but always trying to be conscious of the fact that clothing has its own material properties and will react to, in most cases, the character. And also try to be aware of what you think the costume is made of. If I had an idea in my head that this hat was, not too stiff, but it was loose enough to allow that little rim at the end, were a costume or a clothing made out of silk, it'll move completely differently from one that's made out of, say, cashmere and is heavy. So you need to be at least roughly aware of the density of the material, because that's also going to determine how you animate it and how it moves. So primary and secondary action is very important. One of the important things to remember when we animate is that we're not just pushing arbitrary shapes around a screen. We're supposed to be in the business of acting and communicating personality. So I've always liked the idea of, the Igor character who's, we see the most extreme version in Young Frankenstein, the Marty Feldman performance, which is kind of what I had in mind here. So he's been told, flip the third switch. Yes, master. And then he turns to flip the third switch. So how do we go about getting that? What are the technical issues involved? Some of them that will help us get to this kind of personality. So these are my very cleaned up thumbnails. I had an original thumbnail that was very similar to this, but a bit rougher, but this is about the level of my thumbnail detail. So I'm a thumbnail fanatic. I really believe in strong thumbnails. Of course, these are cleaned up versions with the digital lines in the background. But the essence of it was fairly close to this. And I also plan a lot of my timing as best I can. This, of course, is the final timing, but you get the idea. It's a really nice way to work because then you can, see the entire scene in one look. It's like a super map to the entire action that you need. So the thing I'm drawing your eye to here, as you can probably guess, is the area in red. So I have the poses already read as an Igor kind of character. He's hunched over. He's, a little servile. But how do we translate some of that into like a creepy or a sneaky action? And so I wanted to lead the action with a unusual body part like the shoulder, like the back. He's very stiff, but it reads kind of like little insect like, when you see this kind of thing here. And then we also then lead with the elbow. And then at this point, we can then finish the animation here, ending in the basic generic pose here. This pose could probably be pushed to be even creepier, but at this point I was happy enough with most of what's here in the scene, and a nice simple end pose also works pretty well. Now bear in mind my timing is on 24 frames per second, so if you're animating on 30 frames per second you can pad these numbers a little bit, but you get the idea. So my 23 will be your 29, roughly something like that. So here's the final scene, and as you can see now that your attention has been drawn to the leading action on the shoulder, hopefully you can see it. So as you can see here, the nice creepy pose, which is carried through and amplified. So the leading action actually amplifies that pose characteristic that I wanted the audience to see. So it just really takes him out of the realm of being a pedestrian, everyday figure turning from left to right. Now we have a bit of personality to him. I would carry this through. If I were going to animate this character more, I would build on this. I would do more like that, leading more with the upper body, the shoulder blades in that area, because it seems to really telegraph that kind of characteristic. So anyway, that's a leading action and how you can use a leading action to show the audience personality. One of the things we were taught when it came to animating dialogue or faces back in the classical era, drawing by hand, was to make the dialogue chewy. And this is the kind of thing that they had in mind. It was trying to move the face to articulate it. No, don't be afraid to push and stretch the form of the mouth and the lips to get really strong contrasting shapes. And it achieves one of its most extremes, I guess, in the movies of Don Bluth, my former employer, back from the late 80s, early 90s. And, you can really take this to quite an extent. But you'll also see it in other studios. The Wallace and Gromit cartoons, the stop motion animation from Aardman Studios is a really good example of nice, chewy dialogue. So it's a lot of fun, and a lot more fun than animating the very basic and simple TV animation that we would see back in the day, and a lot of puppet animation done with Flash Harmony these days, if people aren't careful, can be very stiff. So this is the kind of thing you want to try to achieve. So this is what the previous scene looks like when animated. Now these are designs I actually created in a previous course on how to draw cartoon characters for animation. It's in the library if you're interested in learning more about this kind of drawing style. But anyway, here you can see the chewiness. Now the greatest animation for the teeth is the lower jaw. Of course, your lower jaw in reality moves, your upper jaw doesn't move at all. But in this case I have, of course, it's a cartoon, so I have some motion on the upper teeth. Real teeth, of course, we hope, don't do this, but in animation they can. But I would say the animation of the lower jaw is maybe twice, 2.5 times that of the upper. I've also tried to make sure that on each of these two extremes, the volume is fairly consistent. The design looks fairly consistent between each. I mean, it doesn't mean you can just do any old thing. It's important that the likeness is maintained throughout this degree of travel. But in any event, this is the basic principle of chewy dialogue, with just 2 mouth shapes as well. Notice also the lower eyelid. We're pulling the lower eyelid down. It's being pulled by the fleshy mass down a little bit. So the entire area of the eye, the nose, are being affected to varying degrees by the rest of the animation. So we're not just looking at an isolated motion on the lips. It's affecting the nose, the eyelid, even the entire rim of the eye. So again, that's the level of subtlety that you want to aim for if you want your animation to have the classic feature animated look. And just to show you a different graphic to show the different outlines of shapes, we're not, of course, limited to these two shapes. We can have like a really closed ooh mouth and a totally closed mouth here at the upper, or we could even have a closed mouth down here. So I would challenge you, if you want to try to follow this within your own work, to come up with a family of different shapes and really push the positions and try to, when you overlay them, to make sure that they're consistent with one another, but also in good contrast from one another as well.